Okay, so the issue of academic integrity has long been an issue in higher ed. It really blew up quite a bit. Students have been cheating as long as we've had classes, as long as there's been instruction. So that has never completely gone away, nor will it ever. However, during COVID, we saw an explosion in cheating and academic integrity violations, and AI just makes it easier to engage in violations of academic integrity, at least as we see them as instructors. Here are some slides, and I will drop that in the chat too. So you can have your own copy of this if you'd like. And as Steve noted, if you get too many of them, just delete any that you don't want. But at least there'll be some links and other things in here that I think may be helpful. You can either type this in, just click on the link in the chat, or aim your camera at that little dinosaur QR code there. It'll take you right to the Google Slides. And in any of those cases, it will ask you to make a copy and add it to your Google Drive. Um, Okay, so what we know is that the one thing that is ineffective in dealing with AI is to ban all AI use. That basically, if you ban the use of all AI use in your class, unless you provide a really compelling explanation that students will buy into, they're going to think that you're just out of date, that you're out of touch, and they're just going to use it anyway. That I think has been pretty well established in student surveys. And in the experience of many people who've just said no AI use is allowed and just leaving it at that. If you're not going to allow students to use AI, either across the board or on specific types of activities, explain why and have a discussion with students about it. That's really helpful in getting in helping students buy into AI use policies. One problem that I think we've all run into is that while you might strongly suspect AI use, it's fairly rare where you're able to demonstrate clearly that they have used AI. In the first year in which ChatGPT popped out, actually in the first month or so in its existence, I had asked students for in an online course to get use data from or to use reports generated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This was in labor economics class about changes in labor market conditions and to explain it using the concepts that we've just been working on in class in terms of changes in inflation rates, unemployment rates, and so forth, to explain why those changes had occurred. And that was back in the early days of ChatGPT when the training database ended about a year and a half, maybe 2 years before that date. And one of the students posted a response. This was actually in a discussion forum. They posted a response which said, as an AI tool, I do not have access to this data. But if you go to BLS or I think it was stats.bls.gov, you will be able to find the data that will allow you to respond to this. And they didn't even read the response, they just copy and pasted it right in. So that was pretty easy to detect. Other times students have in various classes, because I've seen copies of this that people have shown, have pasted in something where it includes a statement at the end of most prompts, most of the responses, which will say, if you would like this in PDF form, or if you would like other information or other formats, please type them in now, because that's the sort of thing that comes up at the end of an AI response now. And, students could have avoided that if they were just a little bit more careful in reading what they were submitting for their assignments. But otherwise, it's often really difficult. Detection tools are notoriously unreliable. The best of them, under ideal circumstances, which is when students put in a really simple prompt and don't do anything with them, will be accurate about 90 to 95% of the time. The worst ones are reliable much less than that. But they do generate both false positives and false negatives. So they will claim that things have been AI generated that were not, especially if there's a fairly rigid sentence structure and format, or if there's a lot of quotes that are used, even quotes that are cited and so forth. But the rate of misidentification is especially high for multilingual students. If English is not your first language, especially for students who are just really getting comfortable with English, what will often happen is they've been trained in the same sort of way in how to create sentences, how to structure arguments, and so forth. And the writing style is often very similar to the way in which they learned English and so forth. Because they don't have the same breadth of flexibility perhaps in writing as people who grew up writing in English. So the false positive rate is dramatically higher for multilingual students. So it's much more likely that they will be falsely accused of inappropriate AI use. But even no matter how this goes, you can never prove that the items were generated. It's almost impossible if students actually read it and remove anything that is not indicating clearly that it was AI generated. It's really hard to demonstrate this. Um, One thing that's shown up, and this is something that we read about in the reading group we did last fall on the opposite of cheating, and that when students are surveyed about what they believe is a violation of academic integrity or is unethical, their perceptions of this differ quite a bit from those of faculty. That faculty identify a much larger range of issues as being academic integrity violations than students do. One of the most common is asking a friend for assistance or sharing your work with a student so that they can help complete their assignments and often copy and paste what you had submitted and so forth. Students are much more likely to see that as being ethical or appropriate than faculty are, and so forth. And copy and pasting and such things, students don't always recognize that as an academic integrity violation. One problem, though, is that false accusations of AI use generally tend to undermine student trust and make the relationship between instructors and students a bit more challenging. We want to be able to support students, encourage students, but if they don't trust us or think that we're out just to catch them in using AI, that can make for a less productive classroom environment. And we have had some faculty on campus accuse every single person in their class of AI use, in part because of a reliance on AI detectors. And it's possible that every student had done it. But, if someone is falsely accused and threatened with a penalty or is penalized, that can create a really negative environment and it can really damage that student's perception of faculty and so forth. Okay, so there are a lot of surveys of student use, and in general, what surveys indicate that most college students use AI for at least some aspects of coursework, but most students don't use it to complete entire assignments. Like it's fairly rare. Well, by fairly rare, I mean estimates are between like 12 and 18% in surveys where students will entirely complete an assignment with the reliance on AI. What's much more common is they may use it for brainstorming, they may use it for proofreading, they may use it to evaluate their assignments and suggest improvements that they can make and so forth. So in general, it's not that common to use it entirely for assignments, although it's fairly easy to do. Most use it to polish their assignments or to come up with ideas for assignments or for review purposes. Ben.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, in terms of finding out if students use AI, the M dash doesn't have a key on the keyboard.
The M dash is one of the ways that many faculty will identify it. Some students, though, especially those who've done some web design and coding and so forth, are very comfortable with inserting M dashes. I know Rebecca uses them all the time in her writing, and she has long before we had AI tools from the podcast and so forth, because she often suggests that I use them more rather than ellipses, or rather than that dot 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 thing. So in any case, that is one sign that may occur. Now that could be though because they had put something into something that suggested a slight rewrite, but most of the work could have been original with the student. Possibly. but yeah, that is something which is often suggestive of AI use. On the other hand, one of the most popular chatbots out there on ChatGPT is something called the Paraphraser Act. And what it will do is if you upload something that was created by AI, it will rewrite it in a way that is much more, I'm sorry, it's not Paraphraser, that's another app, another program. It's the Humanizer app that will take out the M dashes and replace them either with a dash or something else or commas, etc. So, students who are more adept at trying to avoid being caught using AI can easily run it through the Humanizer app or something similar, and then get those things removed that are often used as a signal of AI use. So, um, and we don't want to only catch those students who are struggling, who don't know how to use AI as well. We'd like to deter them from using AI, perhaps. So we can catch the students who use AI badly, perhaps, or at least we can use signals such as that that would indicate that maybe they did use AI, or maybe though they just did a little bit of polishing with it. Um, and when students are asked why they did this, the most common reasons are they didn't have time to complete it. They got close to a deadline and they had procrastinated. Um, they they recognize that they're struggling in a course and there's a high cost of failure. They may end up being forced out of college and not to get the degree that they were intent to receive, or they're going to disappoint their parents when they get thrown out. Or also, they're not comfortable with their ability to be successful. That if there's a high stakes assignment and they don't really think they know the material well enough to be successful, it's really easy to go back to AI as something that will allow them to achieve that goal of getting their degree or getting that C or better grade in the course so that they are able to complete the degree and move towards their career goals. Um, and throughout students' careers, their focus has been on getting higher grades. And in fact, that's been built into them from the time they enter the school system. And changes in our political and educational environment have put more emphasis on grades. The No Child Left Behind Act and its various revisions later on penalize school districts by taking funding away if students don't make certain grade standards, or a certain proportion of students don't pass those standardized tests and such things. So schools have put, elementary and secondary schools have placed increasing, over the last few decades, have placed increasing emphasis on getting students prepared for those standardized tests. Those standardized tests, though, may not always be the things that give students the best preparation for learning, because they're very rigid, they're very structured, they're multiple choice based, and so forth. And it may limit students' development in other areas that are not being tested in that way. And furthermore, students know that if they need to get to college, they have to get a certain GPA. If they want to pass a course, they need certain grades, and so on. And the focus is pretty much on just getting the highest grades they can. Um, and if we could shift that focus, maybe we could break this down a little bit. But another really common factor, and this certainly blew up during the pandemic too, is perceptions of peer behavior. If you don't want to use AI, but you think all of your classmates are, you're much more likely to do it so that you're not penalized for doing a quality or submitting work that's lower quality than the students who didn't put as much effort in. So to some extent, it's this competitive pressure where, if they think everyone else is doing it, there's an incentive for them to do it too, so that they don't end up doing relatively poorly where they may have learned the material better, but if they still fail their course or if they get a lower grade, they're at a disadvantage. And another reason is that they read all these articles and hear all these stories about how pretty much all companies out there are now using AI in some form in everyday use. And if they believe that they're going to be needing to use AI later, that puts a little more pressure on them to encourage them to use AI during the schooling process, because they think it's important, which is why just an out and out ban without an explanation is often seen as being unrealistic by students. Sometimes a complete ban is appropriate, but students may not understand that unless you are careful to help them understand that. So first, what have you tried? Either turn on your mic or you open your mic and or type something in. Any suggestions on what any of you have done to address the issue of AI or to encourage students not to use it inappropriately? So,
Well,
what?
the only thing I I started doing is just reduce the percentage of uh homework assignments and online quizzes and increase the percentage of in-class exams and final exam because I thought I could never, make students not use AI because I think they're using it all the time. And then a lot of times I see like very big difference between the scores on the online quizzes and those on the exam, like hugely different sometimes.
Mhm. That's one way of doing it. Just shift and do more low stakes or no stakes assessments outside of class, formative assessments where they can practice things, and then keep the graded assessments in class where you can observe it. Because if they're doing it in class, it's much more difficult, at least, to rely on AI. And that strategy can work. Mhm. Any others?
I have demonstrated in class how to use AI to generate questions that they can practice on and proofread and understand further the way that students need to learn how to practice and proofread use with a calculator or use of online statistics packages, since it's not just a matter of knowing how to use it, but knowing how to proofread it as well, so that students can sort of realize that, AI can be great for strengthening your understanding and providing you an opportunity to get more practice in, but it's not something you want to use just to do the work and never look or proofread again as to whether or not you're doing it properly, just like how you don't blindly trust calculators output or blindly trust an online statistic computation package blindly without looking at it yourself to make sure that everything was in the right place.
Mhm. Yeah, teaching them how to use AI effectively and warning them about the benefits of or the concerns that may happen in terms of mistakes it may make, and being able to verify the results that you have trust in them, which also requires that you have enough skill in the discipline to be able to evaluate it correctly. That's a very good approach. And Ben?
Yeah, what I try to do in my AI course policy, I identify the ones they can use with AI, the ones they shouldn't use with AI, and providing reasons why they shouldn't. Let's take, for instance, in conducting interviews, with a teacher, you just have to go to that teacher, interact with that teacher, because it will improve your career network. It will do a lot of things to really do it yourself, as against telling AI to do it for you. Then if you even should use I want to know really what you did with AI, what AI did, and what improvements you made, to improve your work yourself. So
Mhm.
that way, you try to negotiate the use of AI. So, and there been quite a positive response on their part. Though I teach mainly adults, somehow some of them even wouldn't know how to use AI. In some of the interactions, some are quite, resistant in using AI at all. So, but still, I said, you are going to teach people who are going to be professionals. You don't have any excuse not to know how to use AI, because a lot of occupations are using it, and you'll be doing your students disservice if you don't encourage them or show them how to use it. So that's been my approach.
Mhm. Yeah, telling students where it's appropriate to use it, when it's not, they're more likely to buy into that than just a blanket ban, and talking about how to use it appropriately and effectively. As Michael said, using it for practice things and to generate your own practice things and tutorials can be really effective. Okay, so that all works. Now, oh wait, okay, it wasn't responding too well. Okay, so one thing to do is to be transparent about this, and that's basically, I think, partly what Ben and Michael were talking about there. I think, and also, well, I think everyone's talked about this to some extent, that clearly define when, where, and how AI use is allowed or not allowed in your class. And the key is, or to really get students to buy in, making clear why. Remind students of the skills they need to develop and the importance of those skills, and know that if they're just taking a short circuit on their learning and they're skipping those steps, they're not going to develop the skills to be able to critically evaluate the output and to make sense of it and to determine whether the output is valid or appropriate for whatever they're working with. Um, and explain how AI could hinder or foster that, or in some cases, AI can be used to complement learning, complement your work. In other cases, it could be used as a substitute for learning. And we want to make clear why. And that's something that can also change over the course of the semester. That some skills, some early in courses, for example, in writing classes, many people will completely ban the use of AI because it's important to go through that struggle, that productive struggle of developing some skills. But as you move further into the course, or maybe at higher level courses, it may be appropriate to use AI for more brainstorming and other purposes. And that's going to be very different depending on students' stage of development, educational development, as well as the specific learning objectives of the course. Um, and again, I encourage, and this is something that a lot of people encourage, is for people to consider co-creating in AI policy. That basically, at the very beginning of the class, maybe even the first day, talk to students about the policy and try to get them to buy into it. Because if students share in the process of development, they share their opinions and think about why it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, and if you come up with a policy that you can then embed in the syllabus, they're much more likely to buy it if they help create it, because again, it gives them a little bit more sense of autonomy and a little bit more of sense of commitment to the policy. Especially if they hear other students agreeing to it, you eliminate that negative peer effect that could occur when they think everyone else is going to be using it, or it can certainly weaken that sort of pressure. We do have a policy on campus of including an AI policy in the syllabus, but I'd also suggest including that explicitly on each summative assessment for each test, each more higher valued thing where you're evaluating students' learning, explicitly state whether AI is used or not used. And that way, again, it's really easy for students to forget things you put in the syllabus, which is something they generally look at perhaps at the beginning or when you discuss it, etc. But it's really easy for them to forget it because each class has different policies, especially now. There's a wide variety of how faculty are encouraging or discouraging students from using AI, and it would be really helpful to make it explicit so they know. And that could be part of adopting the transparency in learning and teaching approach developed by Marianne Winklemas, where that's part of the instructions on the assignment, whether AI use is allowed or not as part of the description of the assignment. And again, we had an earlier session on that, and it's pretty easy to use AI to generate those things if you don't want to do it yourself, where you have, the three components of the thing where students are given the purpose of the assignment, the tasks that are required to be done, and then how they're going to be evaluated on it. Okay. Another thing you can do is try to use some strategies, and this came up also in our discussion, of reducing the net benefits from improper AI use, either raising the costs or lowering the benefits. And one is just to scaffold assignments, that students are more likely to use it when they're facing time pressure, when there's a deadline coming up, and they have to do a lot of things really quickly. I experienced something like that last night when I realized I had scheduled 5 workshops for myself today, which was a really bad plan, but it didn't seem that as bad, maybe a month ago when I put the schedule together. But in general, if you take big complex assignments and break them up into parts, where at each part they're doing a small part of it, they're much less likely to face that time pressure or constraint, especially if you're giving them feedback and so forth as they work through it. So, for example, if you have a major writing project or a major research project, start off by having them submit a proposal and give them some feedback on that based on whether it may be feasible or not, or some suggestions on things they may want to revise or things they may want to consider. And then maybe have them do if it's a more formal research paper, maybe have them do a bibliography, and then give them some feedback on the articles they've included and the quality of those, the appropriateness, whether they're peer reviewed, et cetera. And then maybe the next step, have them do an annotated bibliography, and then have them come up with an outline of their project. Then have them do maybe a review of the literature. Then have them submit initial results if it's an empirical study or whatever. Or, depending on the nature of the project, break it up into small chunks, and then it's less threatening to students, especially if they know they can make mistakes that can be corrected before they go on to the higher valued things. And the weights on those could get progressively higher. It could be 5% of the project grade may be on the early stages, maybe 20 or 30% on the later stages, on each of the later stages. And that way, if they, instead of just giving them this assignment where either they're going to do it really well, or they went off in a wrong direction early and they're kind of lost. It makes it much more likely that they're going to be successful, but also they're less threatened by the possibility of screwing up somewhere along the way if they're getting feedback all the way through. Using cooperative learning activities. Our dean gave a really nice talk on that, actually. The dean from the School of Liberal Arts, Sciences, and Engineering, as the new title goes, gave a really nice talk on using collaborative learning. And if you have students work in small groups in class, they're much less likely to, or just classwork in general, but by having them do some group work, they're engaged with each other and they're less likely to rely on AI, especially if some of this is occurring in the classroom where you can wander around and monitor them and, interact with them. The other thing is do more proctored exams. As Holly Reza suggested, if you're going to have them do assessments in class, then they're less likely to rely on AI. It takes more effort to cheat on an in-class exam than it does something done asynchronously. Or something that more and more people are starting to consider. It's really costly, especially in larger costs in terms of times. Some people have moved to oral exams again, which used to be really big a century or two ago, but they're a little bit less common today, mostly because it can be really time consuming. But some people are doing that. Another thing is using authentic assessments. We had a session on that earlier, but basically where students intrinsically value the work that they're doing and see that it's aligned to their future career or life objectives. And if you can tie in the assignments to something that they value, it makes it easier for them to commit the effort to do the work themselves, or they see the intrinsic value of the work that they're doing, and they might be less likely to rely on AI to do that. And another way of helping students or reducing the net benefit, basically by increasing the value of the assignments, is by allowing multiple means of action and expression, which is one of those three components of the UDL approach. And basically, what this is all about is letting students express themselves in a way that they're more comfortable with. If you're having them do a project, one approach to this is an unessay, where instead of having them write an essay, you let them submit or demonstrate their learning in any form other than an essay. It could be a video, it could be a podcast, it could be an infographic or a series of infographics. It could be it could be a game they create, it could be an online game they create, it could be a board game they create. You can give students more realm, more range. And again, this will vary from discipline to discipline, but there may be some ways of demonstrating their learning in a way other than just on an exam or on a paper. And, when that's feasible, it can be much more enjoyable for the students because they have more fun with these projects. And it's also much more enjoyable for the instructor because we're getting not to have to read, we no longer have to read the same sort of paper topics over and over again, or the same exam essays or the same problems over and over again. if, again, you can align that with the learning objectives for your course. Another way of doing it is let students use AI, but focus not so much on the product that they produce, that students produce, but on the process. Let them use AI, but make it visible. Observe how they're using AI and observe how, and let them use AI specifically in ways where you can see what they're doing and what they're bringing to the project and what they're learning from the project in terms of how they interact with AI and how they use it to complete some sort of a project, but focus on their learning project process rather than just on the output. And a common way of doing this is to include more metacognitive reflection as part of the assignments, where students are reflecting on their learning at each stage, what they learned that they didn't understand before, and have them reflect on the skills they're developing. And by doing that, it tends to increase the amount of learning and their ability to recall and transfer the knowledge to other applications. There's a growing amount of research on the benefits of metacognition. And again, making the learning process visible, where if students are using AI, you could have them share their interactions with AI with you. They could share a link to it, or they can copy and paste it into a document or into a Google Doc or into an assignment in Brightspace, et cetera, where you actually observe that and you can observe the individual's contributions. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I clicked on the link accidentally there. Let me come up. But one of the ways of doing that is, there we go. Well, one way of doing this is if you have students do some readings or other things, or you can use social annotations where students, if you want students to read journal articles or other things that, other readings that are online, let them annotate it. And it's less likely that they're going to be using, well, in this case, they're not using AI so much for it because it's actually, this could have fit into the other slide actually. But one of the things I noted was that when students were presenting journal articles or working papers in the capstone course in my economics or mathematical economics course, and I assigned them articles to read and present, they were generating AI summaries that they were then presenting, but they really didn't always understand those things so well. But what I've had them do the last the last 4 or 5 years, actually, this goes back before AI became widely available. What I've had them do is in the week leading up to the discussions is have each student provide some annotations where they're evaluating the arguments in the papers, the research papers or the articles themselves, the working papers or journal articles. And then you can see how they're interacting with the document. And it's much easier for them just to type their interactions there than it would be to copy the paper and then ask it to generate annotations. So you can observe what they're learning, what they're questioning, what they're struggling with, and so forth by the way they interact with the document and with each other, because these are threaded, they can essentially create threaded discussions right in a journal article or right in a working paper. And that can be kind of useful. Another way in which I've had students, when they're doing some projects, is share the work, and I create the accounts for them. Well, not, let me rephrase that. I create a class drive folder, and then I share it with them, but I create separate folders for each of the group, but give the whole class the rights to all that, where essentially we can observe the work that they're doing as it progresses through. So everyone can see the drafts that everyone else created. Everyone can see the bibliographies or the annotated bibliographies, etc. And then I've had them at each stage of the work, for example, after they generate the first draft of their paper, I'll download each groups. They're working in small groups. I'll download those groups' papers as a PDF, upload it into Hypothesis, and then let them annotate it, let them provide feedback to each other. And that also has worked pretty well. And you can evaluate the contributions of each student either by looking at the edit history of those documents, or something I picked up from Jessica Kruger, who's at Buffalo, was when she was doing a project similar, well, a somewhat different project, but she had groups working on creating short chapters of a book she was using for instruction in that very semester. She just had each student write in a different color, allowing enough color contrast so that when you look at it, you could use the colors that they were writing in to see who wrote which portions of that shared document, et cetera. And that worked pretty well. So I could see how much each person contributed, what they contributed, and so forth. So it was easy to observe what their work was. And again, I jumped over to that same document. Okay. And integrate the AI use explicitly. Tell students how they can do it and have them share it. I mentioned that before. For writing assignments, one approach which has been developed by a consortium of schools in California is the PAIR project. It's a peer and AI review and reflection process where students first create something themselves. They create a writing assignment themselves, and then they submit it to peer review, and they submit it to AI review. And then they evaluate the quality of the peer review, the AI review, and then they revise the work based on this. And that can all be done using a GPT or a chatbot that you create, where they submit all of this at each stage into it, and it generates an output where you get to see each stage of the project. You get to see what the students had submitted, what reviews they received from peers, what the AI provided, have them reflect on those things, and then the final product. And you can observe, again, the process by which this is all taking place. And this gives you a link to it as well as more information about it. Anna Mills is one of the people who helped develop this and has been working actively in disseminating this approach. So it's using AI, but it's using AI in conjunction with peers as well as the instructor. So the instructor obviously also provides review and reflection, but by the time the instructor gets the product, they've already gone through a number of stages of revision. I don't use this process exactly. In fact, I started doing this before we had AI, but I've had students do peer review for each other, and then I provide feedback at each stage as well. Another issue is, earlier I mentioned that one of the things research tells us is that students' views of what's ethical in terms of helping each other or getting support often differs quite a bit from our views. And partly because we've been involved in academia quite a bit longer than this, and our views of this have evolved over time. And we also came through often at a somewhat different time period. But one argument, and this was something that's talked about extensively in The Opposite of Cheating, is maybe we should focus a little bit more at the institutional level, or even in our own classes, is perhaps giving students scenarios that align with some of the issues they may be facing, that tied to professional norms in our own disciplines. For example, I'm not at the best point right now to come up with very creative examples. I'm kind of exhausted, but perhaps give them a situation where they're in a work environment and someone shares their work as if it was their own, and how they would react to that. And then maybe make some analogies to how that might be the same sort of case when someone else uses you or submits portions of your work for their grade and so on. Have them discuss some issues related to intellectual property, taking credit for work that's not your own. And generally they can make that sort of connection, but then align it to the values we'd like to have students use when they're doing their work in our classes, and perhaps looking at what happens if they misrepresent the skills that they possess when they apply for a job or start working on a project, by submitting work done by other people, for example. Or and again, this is something I think Michael talked about, was perhaps over relying on AI use, which is not always reliable because of hallucinations and other things. Because really, AI is just a prediction engine. It's predicting words. It's not actually thinking, even though you'll see thinking pop up on the screen. It's a probability model. But if you can help students develop ethics, or help them think about ethical issues so that they're a little bit more salient to them when they're working on projects, that might also reduce some of the academic integrity issues we face with. We're never going to eliminate it. And again, it's always been part of education. But we can help them improve their skills, or help them think more about ethical situations when they're making decisions, perhaps. And, another thing is, and this goes back also partly to the authentic assessment component that we talked about before, is that help students understand what skills they're going to need to be successful in attaining career goals. And, if it may not be obvious how specific things you're asking them to do are, try to tie it to those basic NACE competencies, things like teamwork and critical thinking skills and other things that explain how the things they're doing in our classes connect to that. And maybe again, making that explicit if you're using the tilt approach, saying, the reason I'm asking you to do this is because it can improve your critical thinking skills, which will allow you to be more successful in the workplace, et cetera. And another thing, and this is something that a number of authors who've been working in AI for a bit have argued, is that maybe some of the skills we're teaching may not be as relevant in a world in which AI skills are so common. For example, Jose Bowen notes that, there was a time when he used to regularly correct the grammar and spelling of students. In an AI world, you may not need to worry so much about correcting grammar, other than to tell students that if they are not able to spell or, demonstrate proper grammar, they perhaps should use Grammarly or some AI tools to help polish their writing and so forth. But if the goal is to improve critical thinking skills, perhaps we could explicitly give them some assignments where they have to justify their arguments or evaluate arguments. If the goal is to help them synthesize diverse information, have them read different things and compare them, and again, reason with those things. If the goal is to develop some specific skills, to the extent to which we can observe students engaging in those skills, that can help. If we're, for example, evaluating teamwork and they're working in a group in class, wander around and just see what they're doing and help them develop those skills and point out ways in which they can become more productive when working in teams. And again, our dean gave a really nice workshop on this. I think it was last week. It's kind of a blur for me right now. One other issue in a broad sense is, students will often hear what other people are doing in class, and it might not be a bad idea for there to be some departmental discussions of what sorts of AI are allowed or when AI is used, when it's not allowed, and especially in different sections of the same course. Because if, for example, in one introductory course in the discipline, AI is allowed everywhere, and in another one, it's banned everywhere, that may be a little bit more confusing for students when they talk to other people. If there's at least some consistency across different sections, that reduces some of that issue. And another thing that if you may want to consider is if there are some ethical considerations you want students to think about when they're working through your particular discipline, there's a lot of value in working together. We tend to work in our own silos. I know a couple of times I was doing a pretty significant overhaul of my introductory microeconomics course, and I shared everything I did in that course with everyone else in the department. I told them they're free to adopt anything, but also I appreciated if they would give me feedback on everything. And only one or two people even looked at any of it because we're all very used to working on our own and not sharing it. If we work together, we can make it a whole lot easier, and if someone in your department has a good strategy and they're willing to share it, it's not a bad thing to do. It would make it so much easier if we did a lot more sharing within our departments as well as sharing ideas across things. And that's one of the good things about our reading groups, by the way, that we do get a lot of sharing of ideas where people will, we're all facing similar problems and people will often suggest something and that might work in other disciplines just as effectively. Way back, we did something on mobile apps when iPhones and iPads first started appearing and Android tablets, and someone presented on something in I think it was a biology class that involved human muscular structure and so forth, that was then adopted in art class where they needed to know more about muscle structures and such things. And there were a lot of things where tools were just spread from one discipline to another in ways that might not have been as obvious if we didn't have those cross-disciplinary discussions. Okay, before I want to open it up for a bit more discussion again, but if we do have students that we suspect of this, we should probably start with a conversation, not an accusation, because again, it's we can never it's very rare that we can unambiguously prove that AI use occurred. Um, but a common thing to do, and this has gone back for centuries actually, ask students to explain the process that they use. Ask them to explain the sources that they use, where they came from. Now, if they don't exist, that's a pretty strong evidence of AI use. But often now it's much less common for AI to come up with false sources because it tends to verify those things, especially if they use the thinking models. And also ask them to explain their reasoning. Typically, when students have engaged in something unethical, they will break down and admit to it during the stage. And, it might be useful, especially if it's a low stakes thing where they're just beginning a project, especially if it's a lower level course to focus on helping redirect them into more ethical behavior. We don't want to reward them for using AI use inappropriately. And this was, again, something that came up in the opposite of cheating. For example, you don't want to have an incentive system where if someone submitted work that was because they were facing pressure, time pressure, they submitted work that was generated by AI. If you give them a 1 week extension to generate their own work, you're essentially giving them a reward that wasn't given to other students. So if you're going to do something, make it so that students are not benefiting from using AI inappropriately. But again, we do have very high levels of usage of these things in ways that we consider inappropriate. And, if we can help students learn when it's appropriate and not, and what is ethical use of AI, that can be really good. But also make sure you provide due process. We don't want to be ICE employees. We do want to go through and give people a chance to state their case and to evaluate evidence and, not just randomly charge people or shoot people or do other things. But also we do need to follow the campus academic integrity policies, which means if we think someone did this, we need to discuss it with them or give them the opportunity for that discussion. We've had a couple of sessions on that, which have all been recorded, and the associate deans have done lots of presentations on this. And that's all I have. So, what else? What else have you done and or thought of doing or tried, and etc.?
One thing that I know about generating examples for with AI is that sometimes when students generate the examples, they can't help but just look at the answer immediately when it shows up without trying to do it themselves first. Do you know if these AI programs have spoiler tags built in that you can request generate a question, but spoiler tag the answer so that it doesn't show up until I click on it or highlight it? Is that something that ChatGPT, Gemini, and of these other AI programs have built into them yet? Because if it
No,
did, I
there
think that'd
has
be very helpful.
Yeah, there have been suggestions that output be watermarked, but it's generally pretty easy to defeat those types of things. That basically the watermark things would be only observable with certain tools or something similar. But again, just copying the text layer and pasting into another document would be a way around that. It's hard to come up with a way of doing that that would not be easily defeated, which is why they haven't generally done that. Um, yeah, that's tough. It would be nice if if that could be done, but at this stage, it's not. It would be easier with image files where they could encode something into it, that could only be detected by a program of some sort. But again, if it we have the everyone who gets that output would have the same abilities to edit it and could duplicate that process and undo it. It's one of those situations where every time we come up with a way of catching something or detecting something, other people find ways around it. If you do a search on the web for AI detection, defeating AI detection, especially if you look at YouTube, you'll find a tremendous number of videos out there that will show you how to defeat AI detection. And I think the same would probably be true if there was some sort of a tag like that.
Would you recommend that we just not try to use automated AI detection kits because of how commonly they identify false positives uh, or just make mistakes along the way?
I don't use them myself. However, uh, I go back and forth on this in my own thing. Mostly with the types of assignments I'm giving them in many of my classes, it would be it's pretty easy to see the contributions of students because when they're giving presentations each week, I ask some questions during that, which does check their understanding. And if they're making arguments that they really have no clue what they're talking about, it's pretty clear that that's the case. And I try to build in ways where they are kind of forced to learn this as they move through when they're doing the annotations and commenting on each other's work. But occasionally that does show up, and I'll have a chat with that student. Um, and the final product is usually something that's been iterated on so many times by so many people, it would be a bit harder for them to do it, although AI can do all those things and it would not be that easy to detect. But if it looks like it looks like something was AI generated, I'll generally just talk to them about it and say, I understand the temptation you face, but this really should reflect your own work and so on. And some of the work is done in class, or at least in terms of choosing the directions they're going to be going on their projects. So Anna Mills is an interesting case in point. She's done a lot of work with AI in writing. Originally, she was arguing against AI detection, and then about 6 months ago, she changed her views on it. But she uses it in a way where, she tells students she's going to be using it, and if it's flagged at a relatively high level, she's going to talk to the students. She says when they early on and when she talks to them, I know these tools can make mistakes, but the output you produce does not seem to be indistinguishable from something that AI has produced. And if your work is looking like it was created by a prediction engine and it's not reflecting your own contributions, regardless of how that came about, that's not a very good product. So you're going to need to revise this in a way that makes it more obvious that this is your own voice, this is your own work. So, in that way, she's not directly accused. And sometimes, and often she'll use that same approach of asking them questions, and then they will often generally just admit that they used AI for some component. She did know that sometimes they'll show her the work that they did at each stage, and they'll show her a draft that they had produced individually, which is very rough, but then they'll say, and I submitted this to an AI program to improve the grammar and the flow of it. And she'll often say, well, that seems appropriate because it's clear that you had done all the work up to this point. But if it sounds rather robotic, she'll say you're still producing something that does not appear to be produced by a human being. And if you want to have skills that are going to be helpful in finding a job, if all you're doing is generating something that's equivalent to a chatbot, that's not going to give you any sort of an edge in competing with a high school graduate or even a high school dropout when you apply for work. So, make sure that you're able to express your own individual contributions. And to what extent individual contributions of college graduates are going to be valued in the labor market is at this point really unknown. And it's really kind of scary. And it's scary for students as well. So, but yeah, I wish there was an easy way of tagging things that were AI produced, but not at the present moment. Any other thoughts or suggestions? It's a challenge we're all facing, and none of us really asked for this, but we're kind of stuck with it. And until we come up with better solutions, there's not much we can do other than try to motivate students to do work which is their own and try to deter them from these things. And I wish there was a simple way of saying, here's how we can avoid all of this, but there isn't right now, and probably will never be. But students have always cheated. It's just more severe now than it used to be. Okay, well, I'll stop the recording.